While the U.S. justice system claims to be blind to gender, race, and identity, history often tells a different story. Among the hundreds executed across the country, a small but deeply significant number of those sent to death row identified as part of the LGBT community. These are not just stories of crime and punishment. They are stories shaped by societal bias, legal controversy, and in some cases, historic firsts. In this dive into America's death chambers, we uncover the rare but powerful cases of LGBTQ individuals who were executed in the United States. These are the LGBTQ names etched into death row history, executed not only by law, but often judged by their identity. Amber McLaughlin, born Scott A. McLaughlin. State of execution, Missouri. Execution date, January 3, 2023. Amber McLaughlin was convicted for the brutal 2003 murder of her former girlfriend, Beverly Genther, in Missouri. At the time of the crime, McLaughlin was known as Scott A. McLaughlin and had not yet transitioned. The two had previously been in a relationship, but Genther had filed for a restraining order after repeated instances of stalking and harassment. Despite the legal action, McLaughlin continued to harass her, watching her place of work and leaving threatening notes. On November 20, 2003, McLaughlin waited for Genther outside her job, ambushed her in the parking lot, assaulted her, and stabbed her to death before dumping her body in a remote area near the Mississippi River. The case was particularly disturbing due to the premeditated nature of the attack. McLaughlin wore latex gloves, carried a knife, and had planned the confrontation. Evidence presented during the trial showed that Genther feared for her life and had taken extensive steps to protect herself, including notifying her colleagues and law enforcement. Despite those efforts, McLaughlin was able to follow through with the murder. The victim's body was found days later, confirming the worst fears of her family and investigators. During the trial, McLaughlin's defense team presented a case based on her history of trauma, mental illness, and brain damage, citing childhood abuse and neglect. While jurors convicted her of the crime, they were deadlocked during the sentencing phase. As a result, under Missouri law, the judge imposed the death penalty, one of the few states that allow a judge to make that decision without a jury's consensus. McLaughlin spent nearly 2 decades on death row appealing the sentence. During that time, she transitioned and began living openly as a transgender woman, becoming the first openly transgender person executed in the United States. Amber's execution reignited national conversations about capital punishment, mental health, and LGBTQ+ rights. Advocates argued that her gender identity, history of trauma, and lack of jury-sentenced death penalty warranted clemency. However, Missouri Governor Mike Parson denied the clemency request. McLaughlin was executed by lethal injection on January 3, 2020. Her death marked a somber milestone in both legal and LGBTQ+ history. Donald Donna Harding, formerly Donald Harding. State of execution, Arizona. Execution date, April 6, 1992. Donald Harding, who was known to identify as gay and occasionally used the name Donna in prison, was executed in Arizona for a series of brutal murders that spanned multiple states in the early 1980s. Harding had a long history of violent crime and was convicted of murdering at least 2 men in Phoenix, Arizona. One of his victims, Robert Wise, a 53-year-old man, was bound, gagged, and electrocuted using the wiring from a lamp. Another, Martin Concannon, was found dead in a motel room with similar signs of torture and restraint. Harding's method of killing was particularly cruel, involving sadistic abuse, restraint, and slow asphyxiation or electrocution. Harding was arrested in 1982 after police discovered stolen property from one of his victims in his possession. During the investigation, authorities uncovered connections to at least 6 murders across various states, including Arkansas and Louisiana. Harding reportedly targeted older men, often luring them under the guise of companionship before robbing and killing them. Prosecutors described him as a sadistic predator with no remorse. His trial highlighted not only the brutality of his actions, but also a troubled psychological background marked by abuse and repeated institutionalization from a young age. Harding's time on death row was marked by erratic behavior, legal appeals, and discussions about the cruelty of Arizona's gas chamber execution method. In fact, his 1992 execution became a national controversy. Witnesses described the execution as torturous. Harding reportedly gasped and convulsed for nearly 11 minutes before being pronounced dead. The spectacle of his death led to significant legal and political backlash, eventually prompting Arizona to abandon gas chamber executions in favor of lethal injection. Though Harding never officially transitioned or identified as transgender, various reports and prison interviews confirmed that he identified as gay and at times adopted a feminine persona in prison, using the name Donna. His case, while overshadowed by the gruesomeness of his crimes and his infamous execution, remains one of the earliest known executions of a person from the LGBTQ+ community in the modern U.S. death penalty era. Charles Rhines. State of execution, South Dakota. Execution date, October 29, 2019. Charles Rhines, an openly gay man, was executed in South Dakota for the brutal 1992 murder of 22-year-old Donovan Schaefer, an employee at a donut shop Rhines had previously burglarized. After breaking into the shop to steal money, Rhines encountered Schaefer unexpectedly. When the young man tried to call for help, Rhines bound him with his own shoelaces and stabbed him multiple times in the stomach and back. According to court documents, Rhines laughed as he delivered the fatal wounds, and later told police that Schaefer begged for his life. What made Rhines' case stand out wasn't just the violence of the crime, but the controversy surrounding his trial and sentencing. During the jury's deliberation, some jurors reportedly fixated on Rhines' sexual orientation. Affidavits later revealed that several jurors made statements suggesting that Rhines, being gay, would enjoy life in an all-male prison, and that this influenced their decision to give him the death penalty over life imprisonment. These comments became the basis of numerous appeals claiming anti-gay bias had tainted the sentencing process. Despite raising concerns about juror prejudice and even submitting appeals to the U.S. Supreme Court, Rhines' execution moved forward. Legal organizations and LGBTQ+ advocacy groups, including the American Civil Liberties Union and the National Center for Lesbian Rights, publicly supported his claims and urged courts to intervene, arguing that his death sentence may have been driven more by bias than by justice. Charles Rhines was executed by lethal injection at the South Dakota State Penitentiary. He declined to have a last meal or offer final words. His case remains one of the most discussed examples of how sexual orientation may have played a discriminatory role in a capital punishment sentence, despite legal safeguards meant to ensure impartiality. Stanley Dwayne Lingar. State of execution, Missouri. Execution date, February 7, 2001. Stanley Dwayne Lingar was convicted of the horrific murder of 16-year-old Thomas Scott Allen, which took place on January 6, 1985 in Ripley County, Missouri. Lingar, an accomplice, Jerry Smith, encountered Allen stranded on the roadside and offered a ride under the guise of helping him. Instead, they drove to a secluded area, stripped him, humiliated him by forcing him to masturbate. Then Lingar shot him, beat him with a tire iron, and ran him over with a car, dumping his body in the river. The crime was shocking not only due to its violence, but also the calculated torture preceding the killing. During Lingar's trial, it emerged that he and Smith were romantic partners. Crucially, in the penalty phase deliberations, prosecutors and at least one juror explicitly referenced Lingar's homosexuality, claiming that life in prison for a gay man would offer comfort rather than punishment. One juror reportedly said, "If he's gay, "We're sending him where he wants to go." This pointedly homophobic reasoning became central in appeals, as Lingar's attorneys argued that the death sentence was biased and violated his constitutional right to an impartial jury. Lingar's appeals included efforts by civil rights groups like Amnesty International and LGBTQ advocates such as Queer Watch. However, in May 1999, the Eighth Circuit ruled that the prejudicial comments did not meet the threshold to overturn the sentence. The U.S. Supreme Court declined to hear the case, and on February 7, 2001, Lingar was executed by lethal injection at Potosi Correctional Center. Richard Cornish. State of execution, Virginia Colony. Execution date, 1625. In 1625, Richard Cornish, sometimes referred to as Richard Williams, was hanged in the Virginia colony, reportedly for sodomy involving an indentured servant named William Cowse. At that time, sodomy was a capital offense under English common law, which the American colonies had adopted. Court records suggest Cornish held the position of ship captain and was accused of violating Cowse while drunk aboard the ship Ambrose docked in the James River. Though colonial documentation is sparse, secondary historical sources affirm Cornish was possibly the first person executed in what would become the United States' activity with a man. There is no comprehensive trial record, but witness testimonies indicate that Cornish allegedly made repeated advances toward Cowse and abused his authority over him. Colonial authorities treated this accusation seriously under the strict moral and legal codes of the time. Cornish's fate occurred in a broader context, where early American colonies imposed death penalties for sodomy. In 1636, the Plymouth colony declared sodomy a capital crime, followed by Massachusetts Bay in 1641. Between 1625 and the late 1600s, multiple men were sentenced to death for sodomy, often involving other men or bestiality, although actual executions were comparatively rare due to evidentiary requirements. While Cornish's execution predates modern LGBTQ identities, it illustrates how same behavior was criminalized and punished as a capital offense in early American legal history. His case remains an early, grim precedent in the historical intersection of sexual identity and the death penalty in North America. William Plain. State of execution, New Haven Colony, now Connecticut. Execution date, circa 1646. William Plain was a settler in Guilford, one of the towns in the New Haven Colony, a strictly Puritan-controlled region in colonial Connecticut. Known among his neighbors as a relatively well-established resident, Plain's life unraveled when he was accused of engaging in uncleanness with other males, a euphemism commonly used in Puritan records to describe homosexual activity. His arrest shook the colony, which prided itself on religious purity and harsh moral discipline. His case was among the first in colonial America, where sodomy, as understood under biblical law, led to capital punishment. Court documents and colonial records, particularly those chronicled by Governor John Winthrop, describe Plain as confessing to repeated acts with other men, some of whom were reportedly underage. In one of the more damning accusations, he allegedly corrupted a young male over 100 times, indicating a long-standing pattern of behavior. His actions were viewed not just as immoral, but as a direct threat to the colony's social and religious order. The concept of moral contagion, the fear that one person's deviance could corrupt an entire community, was central to the Puritan mindset. Plain's case was tried under strict biblical statutes, particularly referencing Leviticus 20:13, which demanded death for men who lie with mankind as with womankind. With little legal separation between church and state, his trial was swift and punishment was absolute. Leaders of the colony, including ministers and magistrates, saw his confession and the accusations as not only credible but deeply sinful and dangerous. In their view, executing Plain would serve as a warning to others and a purification of the community. William Plain was ultimately executed around 1646, and though the precise manner of his death is not fully detailed, hanging was the standard method used by Puritan authorities. Governor Winthrop chillingly referred to him as a monster in human shape, a label that underscores the intense dehumanization LGBTQ individuals experienced during the colonial era. Plain's execution remains a stark reminder of how early American society violently criminalized same intimacy under the guise of religious righteousness. These stories go beyond crime and punishment. They offer a glimpse into moments in history where identity may have influenced the outcome of justice. From colonial times to the modern era, a small number of LGBTQ individuals have been executed in the U.S., raising questions about whether personal characteristics played a role in how cases were handled. In several instances, details about a defendant's or gender identity were brought into court, not just as background, but as part of the prosecution's argument. These cases aren't only about guilt or innocence, they show how society has, at times, treated people who didn't fit the norm. Looking back, it's worth asking, were these legal decisions purely based on the facts, or did bias play a part? For more stories like this, be sure to like, share, and subscribe. Sometimes the past tells us more than we expect.